The Dark Ages, a time when daily life was shrouded in mist, chaos, and fear. Political instability, endless wars, and deadly plagues defined the era. One kingdom pretended to fight for honor while secretly scheming against another. Feudal lords waged battles for power, leaving ordinary people trapped in the middle, victims of looting, violence, and despair. Strong infrastructures collapsed, buildings were left to rot, and the Black Death wiped out millions, spreading unimaginable fear and suffering. Everyone looked dirty and weary. Few were truly healthy or clean. Life was harsh, brutal, and far from humane. Literacy was rare, and superstition ruled over reason. People placed their faith in magic, omens, and strange rituals. Most worked the land as farmers, craftsmen, or laborers, rarely living past 30. Yes, the Dark Ages were truly dark. And yet, modern humanity seems obsessed with them. Pop culture continues to be deeply inspired by this grim era. From J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings to George R.R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire. Though fictional, their worlds echo the violence, mystery, and struggle of the medieval age. Movies like Braveheart, Kingdom of Heaven, and A Knight's Tale draw heavily from the same period. Even video games like The Witcher, Dark Souls, Dragon Age, or Crusader Kings. Anime like Berserk and Vinland Saga. And countless works of music, art, and theater, all shaped by the medieval world. But what was the Dark Age really like? Just how dark were these centuries? And could we still be living in our own kind of darkness today, without even realizing it? For context, the term Dark Ages traditionally refers specifically to Western Europe in the centuries following the fall of the Roman Empire. Although modern historians often include parts of the East, such as China and the Islamic world, originally, this term applied mainly to Western Europe. And for the purpose of this video, we'll focus on that region to uncover just how dark the Dark Ages truly were. After the height of the Roman Empire in the 2nd century AD, decline slowly crept in. Outlying provinces began to weaken, inflation spiraled out of control, and external threats pressed harder at the borders. Diseases spread, the army grew bloated, and endless military spending forced the state to raise taxes again and again. Administration became more centralized, landowners dwindled, and chaos followed. Emperor Diocletian tried to fix this by dividing the empire into two, East and West. After a period of civil wars, Constantine the Great restored internal peace and rebuilt the city of Byzantium as the new capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, the city we now know as Constantinople. But even with stability, the gap between the rich and poor grew wider. Constantine's declaration of Christianity as the state religion increased the power of the church and accelerated the Christianization of the empire, especially in the East. The great basilicas, once used for administration and trade, were transformed into houses of Christian worship. Illuminated manuscripts, decorated with gold and vivid miniatures, began to appear, alongside the rise of silent reading, the practice of reading in silence, which started spreading by the 5th century. Meanwhile, new civil wars and invasions brought chaos to the empire's borders. Gothic tribes and other barbarian groups migrated and invaded Roman territories, splintering the Western Empire into smaller political units. One such leader, Odoacer, overthrew Romulus Augustulus, taking control of Italy and marking the true fall of the Western Roman Empire. What remained was the Eastern Roman Empire, what we now call Byzantium. The Byzantine Empire became deeply intertwined with Christianity. Theological debates now held political weight. Emperor Justinian led the empire through triumphs and disasters, rebellions, invasions, and desperate defenses of Constantinople against the Avars, Slavs, and Persians. In the West, the fragmented remains of Rome turned into a patchwork of small kingdoms constantly at war with each other. The loss of Roman administration and infrastructure crippled trade, education, and cultural exchange. Cities shrank or were abandoned, and literacy plummeted. Feudalism emerged as the dominant social and economic system of medieval Europe. And then, something even darker came. Barely half a century after Rome's fall, the worst year in human history arrived. In the year 536, Byzantine historian Procopius wrote that the sun looked like the moon, shining without brightness for an entire year. Another chronicler, Michael the Syrian, recorded that the sun was dim for 18 months, barely shining for 4 hours a day with a pale, weak light. Fruits failed to ripen, and wine turned sour. Researchers today believe a massive volcanic eruption caused this catastrophe, filling the atmosphere with ash that darkened the skies across the globe. Harvests failed. Famine spread from Europe to Asia. Even in Ireland, records mention a failure of bread. With malnutrition came disease. A deadly plague erupted in Constantinople. Corpses piled up in the streets and were thrown into the sea, only to wash back ashore. Those healthy enough to dispose of the dead soon fell ill themselves. The city became a nightmare. This became known as the Plague of Justinian, named after the emperor of the time. Scientists have found traces of volcanic eruptions in ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica dated around the year 536. Further eruptions in 540 and 547 deepened the global chill, blocking sunlight and triggering what is now called the Late Antique Little Ice Age, a mini ice age that lasted for over a decade, devastating crops and causing mass starvation. Even across the ocean, the Mochi civilization in Peru suffered from floods and droughts that destroyed their irrigation systems and farmlands. The planet was blanketed in mist for years, and the climate disruption lasted for decades. It was as if nature itself was signaling the beginning of the Dark Ages in Western Europe, warning of the great changes to come. After the fall of Rome, education decayed. Religious teachings focused more on music and art than books. The aristocracy turned from literature and philosophy to feasts and power struggles. Family alliances among nobles became stronger, but so did their rivalries. Women's roles were limited to wives and mothers, and female power was often seen as unnatural or dangerous. Land ownership became complicated. Some land was communal, others privately owned by the aristocracy, while peasants worked the fields. The law drew clear lines between the free and the unfree, yet there was still some social mobility. A free peasant family could rise into the ranks of the nobility through military service. In Italy, the Ostrogothic kingdom under King Theodoric maintained much of the Roman tradition. Despite being Germanic, Theodoric remained loyal to the Eastern Emperor. The Senate still met in Rome, and the rights of the Pope were respected. But city life declined dramatically. Rome's population fell from about 1 million to only 50,000. Across northern Europe, cities also shrank. Civic monuments and public buildings were stripped for materials. With trade routes broken by invasions and migrations, long-distance commerce was replaced by local production. Coinage nearly disappeared. Bronze coins continued to circulate, but gold coins were used only for exceptional purchases, like land or luxury goods. Despite everything, the idea of a unified Christian world endured, even as differences grew between the Eastern and Western churches. Tension rose between the native Roman population and the Germanic rulers who followed Arian Christianity. Arianism taught that church and state should remain separate, while Roman Catholicism saw the empire as a divine instrument, a unity of church and state. This deepened the ideological divide. As Muslim conquests spread into Byzantine territories, the influence of the Roman Catholic Church weakened in the West. Monasteries became powerful centers of local authority. They managed land for noble families and served as hubs of education and politics. In many regions, monasteries were the only places of literacy. Monks preserved ancient Latin manuscripts and produced new works of history, theology, and philosophy. By the 10th century, the involvement of lay nobles in church affairs reached its peak. Wealthy families treated monasteries as private property, and simony, the selling of church offices, became common. This caused fear among believers, who thought priests appointed through corruption could not perform valid sacraments like baptism. In response, monastic communities tightened their rules. The founding of the Cluniac Monastery in 909 sparked a major reform. Cluny was freed from local control and placed directly under papal protection. The Cluniac reforms proved that the Church could purify itself by submitting to papal authority, strengthening the idea that the Church should be free from secular interference, able to fulfill its spiritual mission in purity and independence. By placing monasteries directly under the Pope's authority, the Church began to rebuild its moral power, setting the stage for the next great era of medieval transformation. During the High Middle Ages, European society was divided into three distinct social classes: the clergy, who oversaw religious matters, the nobles, who owned vast lands, and the common people, who made up the majority of the population. At the very heart of this system stood the Church, the most powerful institution of medieval Europe. The Church held immense spiritual authority. It dictated religious practices and beliefs, serving as the bridge between God and humankind. But its influence didn't stop there, it also wielded great political power. Bishops, abbots, priests, and monks often owned large estates and immense wealth, making the Church the largest landowner and one of the most powerful economic forces in Europe. Through taxes, donations, and land management, it shaped nearly every aspect of medieval life. Pilgrimage sites like Rome and Jerusalem drew countless visitors from across the continent, while new holy destinations, such as Monte Gargano, began to rise in fame. The reform movements within the Church gained widespread support, yet some radical groups, like the Waldensians and Cathars, rejected Catholic teachings. In response, the Pope launched inquisitions to suppress what he called heresies. Meanwhile, new monastic orders such as the Carthusians and Cistercians emerged, followed by the Franciscans and Dominicans, monks who lived in poverty, surviving solely on charity. By the 11th century, stone castles began to rise across regions where central authority was weak. In Central Europe, tall tower keeps became popular, while in Italy, wealthy families built impressive towers in their city homes as symbols of power. Massive pilgrimages also inspired the construction of great churches, giving birth to Romanesque architecture, with thick stone walls, decorative carvings, and grand domes inspired by ancient Roman design. Mystical figures like Francis of Assisi became beloved symbols of faith, and many mystics were women, such as Hildegard of Bingen, a scholar and visionary revered in her time. Even Jewish mysticism flourished, reaching its peak with the creation of the Zohar, the cornerstone of Kabbalistic teachings in the 13th century. The clergy itself was divided into two main groups, secular and regular clergy. Secular clergy were parish priests who directly served the spiritual needs of the community. They weren't bound by strict monastic rules but were responsible for leading Mass, performing sacraments like baptism, marriage, and communion, and providing spiritual guidance through pastoral visits. They interacted daily with local people, becoming the face of the Church in everyday life. The regular clergy, on the other hand, consisted of monks, canons, and friars who lived according to specific religious rules within monastic communities. Their lives were structured around prayer, work, and meditation, often involving education, scholarship, or social service. They followed strict vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, dedicating themselves entirely to spiritual devotion. One of the most defining rules was clerical celibacy, which forbade priests from marrying. The purpose was to ensure complete dedication to God and the Church, free from the distractions of family life. This celibate lifestyle set the clergy apart from the laity, marking a life wholly centered on spiritual service. Ecclesiastical courts handled cases of religion and morality, while monasteries and cathedrals became the intellectual centers of medieval Europe. These institutions preserved knowledge, educated the elite, and produced important manuscripts that shaped the cultural and political landscape of the era. The Church granted moral and spiritual legitimacy to rulers through coronation ceremonies and blessings, influencing public policy through sermons and church councils. Monasticism played a vital role in preserving and spreading knowledge. Monasteries were not just religious centers, they were also hubs of learning, agriculture, and craftsmanship. Monks meticulously copied manuscripts by hand, preserving ancient classical texts and religious writings that might otherwise have been lost forever. However, the rigid social hierarchy limited social mobility and stifled economic innovation. Land and resources were tightly controlled by the nobility and the Church, both of whom prioritized stability and tradition over progress. The people's main focus was spiritual life and salvation, often considered far more important than scientific discovery or technological advancement. The Church's authority extended deep into the realms of justice and politics, making it one of the most powerful institutions in medieval Europe. It could suppress ideas that challenged its doctrines, shaping not only faith but also how people thought and governed. Between roughly 950 and 1060, while droughts, famines, and revolts struck the Middle East, Byzantium, and Egypt, Western Europe entered an unexpected era of growth. Its population nearly doubled, from about 35 million to 80 million between the years 1000 and 1347. Historians still debate why, but improved farming techniques, the expansion of arable land, a warmer climate, and fewer invasions all likely played key roles. The three-field rotation system made farmland more productive, while the heavy plow and horse collar allowed for deeper and faster tilling of the soil. This population boom, combined with agricultural productivity and relative political stability, sparked what's known as the commercial revolution of the Middle Ages. People began investing in valuable goods like salt, silk, and wine, trading across vast distances. Commerce led to innovations such as gold coinage and bills of exchange, the early precursors to banking. New towns rose as centers of trade, supported by kings and nobles who saw opportunity in economic growth. Many urban communities gained autonomy, giving birth to the rise of self-governing cities. The maritime republics of Italy, Venice and Genoa, dominated Mediterranean trade routes, while German merchants formed the Hanseatic League to control trade in the north. Jewish merchants, often acting as moneylenders, spread across Europe, playing crucial roles in commerce despite facing waves of persecution and expulsion. At the heart of all this stood feudalism, the backbone of medieval society. It structured both social order and the economy during this uncertain time. Under the feudal system, a lord would grant a portion of his land to a vassal, in exchange for service. This service could take the form of agricultural production, loyalty, or most importantly, military support. In return, the vassal was protected by his lord and gained status within the rigid social hierarchy. Feudalism became the glue that held medieval Europe together, a delicate balance of duty, loyalty, and land. In return for their service, vassals were granted protection and justice from their lords. But as heavy cavalry became more prominent, the once unified warrior class began to split into two distinct groups. Those wealthy enough to equip themselves as mounted knights joined the traditional aristocracy, while the rest faded into the ranks of the common peasantry. This new elite class solidified its power through strict inheritance customs, such as primogeniture, the right of the eldest son to inherit the family estate intact. Noble families were defined by the lands they owned and the people who served them. Lesser nobles, without land or vassals of their own, often depended on alliances or military service to maintain their status. Yet, the nobility was not an entirely closed circle. A king could elevate a commoner to the ranks of the aristocracy as a reward for loyalty or service. Wealthy merchants could marry into noble families, while impoverished aristocrats could easily lose their privileged position. Western aristocrats often migrated to the violent frontiers of the Latin world, some serving under local rulers who valued their military skill, while others sought their fortune as conquerors. At the core of medieval economics stood the manorial system, the practical foundation of feudalism. Each manor or estate served as a self-sufficient agricultural unit, managed by a lord who wielded both political and military authority. These lords were responsible for protecting their lands and administering justice within their territories. Lesser nobles and knights, known as vassals, received land in exchange for military service, bound by sacred oaths of loyalty and duty. Manors produced nearly everything needed for survival: food, clothing, and tools. They contained fields for crops, pastures for livestock, and workshops where craftsmen made agricultural tools and household goods. At the bottom of this social hierarchy were the serfs, peasants bound to the land. Though not slaves, serfs were under the control of their lords, with very limited rights and mobility. They made up the majority of the population. Their existence stemmed from the Church's gradual condemnation of slavery among Christians, which by the late 11th century had largely replaced traditional slavery with this new system of bonded labor. Unlike slaves, however, serfs had legal recognition. Their obligations and protections were defined by contracts with their lords. Many peasants willingly became serfs in exchange for certain economic and legal privileges, lower taxes, the right to farm their own plots, or even to manage local justice within their villages. This gradual transformation reshaped Europe's demographics and cultural map, sparking, among other things, the eastward migration of Germanic peoples, who carried their agricultural techniques and social systems into new territories. The manor was managed in such a way that essential resources, like wood, water, and building materials, could all be produced or gathered from the land surrounding it. This reduced their dependence on external trade for basic needs, though they still exchanged goods with nearby communities for items they couldn't make themselves. Most daily necessities were fulfilled within the manor, making it largely self-sufficient and resilient against outside disruptions. This system provided both economic stability and security during a time often marked by war and political unrest. The Middle Ages are often romanticized, with visions of shining knights, noble ladies, and courtly love, but the truth was far from glamorous. For most people, the medieval era was dirty, harsh, and dangerous. Life was filled with hardship and uncertainty. Only the clergy and nobility lived with any sense of comfort. With poor hygiene, scarce money, rampant diseases, and brutal punishments, common folk had to endure a grim existence. Clergymen and nobles, on the other hand, lived far more comfortably, having access to better food, cleaner living conditions, and greater resources. There was also a deep divide in communication between these three social classes. Commoners spoke Middle English, the nobles spoke French, and the clergy used Latin, creating an even wider social gap. For the common people, the day began early. Markets opened around 6 in the morning and closed by 3 in the afternoon. At night, the town gates were shut, and night watchmen patrolled the streets to keep order. Hygiene was minimal. People often rinsed their mouths with wine or vinegar and used simple methods to keep themselves clean. Toilets and bathhouses existed, but only in public areas, making personal hygiene difficult to maintain. Women were expected to obey men, whether their fathers, husbands, or male relatives. Their roles were centered around household duties, raising children, cooking, and maintaining the home. Peasant women sometimes supplemented the family income by spinning wool, brewing beer, or working the fields during harvest season. City women could engage in trade, but usually only with their husband's permission, and they were often forbidden from taking apprentices. Noble women could inherit land if there were no male heirs, but their primary value was still tied to their ability to bear children. Since women were not ordained as priests, the only religious role open to them within the church was that of a nun. Medieval laws and punishments were notoriously harsh. Serious crimes were often met with death, and trials frequently involved torture. Lesser offenses, like unpaid debts or gambling, were punished through public humiliation or imprisonment. The obligations of vassals to serve their lords in warfare made this era one of constant conflict, leading to countless deaths. Ordinary people often suffered the most from wars they had no part in and little understanding of. Life expectancy during the Middle Ages was shockingly low, usually between 20 and 30 years. This was largely due to the extremely high rates of infant and child mortality. Nearly 1/3 to half of all children died before reaching the age of 5. Diseases such as whooping cough, measles, and influenza claimed the lives of many children. It was a tragic reality that families faced again and again. Yet, if someone managed to survive childhood, their chances of living longer increased significantly. For instance, reaching the age of 20 often meant a person could expect to live another 20 to 25 years. Those who lived past 40 could sometimes reach 60 or even 70 years old. Despite the hardships, medieval communities still found ways to celebrate, with festivals and tournaments. Tournaments were violent spectacles of jousting and sword fighting, grand displays of strength and valor that often drew disapproval from the church. But beneath the surface of pageantry and power, the social hierarchy was far from stable. The nobility, or aristocracy, held enormous influence. By the 11th century, even the election of popes had fallen under the control of the Roman aristocrats. However, Emperor Henry III changed this by appointing reform-minded clergy to the papal throne. With growing support from the public, these reformers asserted papal authority across much of Europe. But not everyone agreed. In the Byzantine East, Patriarch Michael I Cerularius rejected the Pope's supremacy, leading to mutual excommunication in the year 1054. This event, known as the East-West Schism, permanently divided Christianity into the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church. Later, in 1059, the appointment of clergy by secular rulers, known as lay investiture, was officially banned by a council in Rome. But Emperor Henry IV resisted, sparking a major conflict with Pope Gregory VII. This struggle, known as the investiture controversy, raged throughout the 11th and 12th centuries. At its core, it was a battle over power. whether the emperor or the pope held the right to appoint bishops. The emperor sought control to ensure political loyalty, while the church fought to preserve its spiritual independence. While the pope fought to preserve the church's spiritual authority, Emperor Henry IV refused to yield. The clash reached its peak when Pope Gregory VII excommunicated the emperor himself. Eventually, the conflict was resolved in the Concordat of Worms in the year 1122, granting the pope the right to appoint bishops, while the emperor retained his secular power. This marked the rise of secularism in Europe, a shift that would later dominate politics across the continent. The divine right of kings began to emerge, strengthening the idea of sovereign nations. Hereditary monarchies took root, and queens began to rule alongside kings. Royal chanceries became the administrative heart of kingdoms, serving as centers for governance and appeals. Taxes were now collected systematically, as royal domains alone could no longer sustain the crown's expenses. Under Pope Innocent III, papal authority reached its height, even extending into secular politics in central Italy. Meanwhile, within the Holy Roman Empire, the Ottonian dynasty gave way to the Salian line, which was later replaced by the Hohenstaufen dynasty. In France, royal power steadily expanded, though it often clashed with the Dukes of Normandy, who had conquered England under William the Conqueror. Later, Henry II of the Angevin dynasty expanded his territories across France through inheritance and marriage. But his son, King John, lost the northern French lands to King Philip II of France, a defeat that sparked the creation of the Magna Carta in 1215, a historic document limiting royal authority and shaping future concepts of law and liberty. In the Iberian Peninsula, Christian kingdoms began pushing back against Muslim rule. By 1230, the northern Christian lands had united into four major kingdoms: Castile, Aragon, Navarre, and Portugal. Aragon expanded its influence by conquering Sicily and Sardinia, while the southern regions of Iberia remained under Islamic control. Across the north, the Scandinavian kingdoms also thrived. Norway dominated Iceland and Greenland, Denmark extended its reach into Estonia, and Sweden took control of Finland. In Eastern Europe, Kievan Rus and Poland fragmented into smaller states, while Hungary extended its rule over Croatia and other nearby territories. Amid these growing powers, the Church began to take on a more militaristic stance. In response to a plea for help from Byzantium against the Seljuk Turks, Pope Urban II called for the First Crusade in 1095. He urged Christians to reclaim Jerusalem, promising forgiveness of sins to those who took up the cross. Tens of thousands joined the cause, peasants, nobles, and knights, many surviving only by looting, and countless never reaching the Holy Land. The official Crusader army, led by nobles like Godfrey of Bouillon, departed in 1096. They achieved stunning victories against the Turks and established Crusader states in the Middle East. But their survival depended on continuous military aid, which led to a series of subsequent crusades. In 1187, the great Muslim commander Salah ad-Din, known in the West as Saladin, recaptured Jerusalem. The last Crusader stronghold finally fell to the Mamluks of Egypt in 1291. The papacy continued to use Crusader fervor for other campaigns, such as the Reconquista in Spain against Muslim forces, and the Northern Crusades, which forcibly assimilated pagan tribes into Christian Europe. The Fourth Crusade even ended in disaster, with Crusaders sacking Constantinople itself in 1204. The Crusades became deeply embedded in medieval life. Taking the Crusaders' vow could even be fulfilled by paying money, a practice that eventually evolved into the sale of indulgences by church authorities. The Crusades also gave rise to military orders such as the Knights Templar, the Hospitallers, and the Teutonic Knights, who combined monastic life with warfare. The Teutonic Knights even founded their own state in the Baltic region around 1296. By the late 11th century, cathedral schools had begun replacing traditional monastic education. Those that reached the highest academic level were recognized as universities by popes or emperors. The rediscovery of Justinian's Corpus Juris Civilis, the Roman Code of Law, sparked a revival of legal studies at Bologna, laying the groundwork for Western legal systems. Around 1140, a monk named Gratian wrote the Decretum Gratiani, a foundational text of canon law, which would define the Church's legal and moral framework for centuries to come. Around the year 1200, the average global temperature began to drop, marking the beginning of what would later be known as the Little Ice Age. This drastic shift in climate led to severe agricultural crises, culminating in what historians now call the Great Famine between 1311 and 1317. Relentless rainfall flooded farmlands, destroying crops year after year. By 1315, rainfall reached its peak, and desperation spread across Europe. Farmers, facing starvation, were forced to slaughter their livestock just to survive. But even those who endured found their farms ruined beyond recognition. A devastating plague also struck the surviving cattle and sheep, worsening the already dire food shortage. In some regions of northern Europe, it's estimated that up to a quarter of the population perished, not only from hunger, but from diseases that followed in its wake. The church and political institutions lost much of their authority, having failed to provide answers or relief. Faith in divine intervention began to crumble, and in its place, movements arose that questioned the very power of the church itself. But the misery didn't end there. In 1346, Europe was struck by one of the deadliest catastrophes in human history, the Black Death. Carried by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, it wiped out nearly one-third of Europe's population. The plague is believed to have originated from Central Asia, traveling westward through the Silk Road and maritime trade routes. Port cities like Messina, Genoa, and Venice were among the first to fall, and from there, it spread like wildfire. The Black Death returned in waves for decades, up until the 1400s, devastating cities and countryside alike. Those who survived often fled their homes, seeking safer lands and new opportunities. But the consequences of the plague were far-reaching, not just demographic, but economic and social as well. The sharp decline in population led to a labor shortage. Wages rose, landlords struggled to maintain their estates, and for the first time, peasants began to gain bargaining power. Some lands were abandoned entirely or converted into pastures for sheep, which required fewer workers. However, this imbalance also led to inflation and scarcity of goods. Traumatized societies turned to superstition and violence. Jewish communities were scapegoated, and fanatical groups like the Flagellants emerged, wandering from town to town, whipping themselves in hopes of divine forgiveness. Governments, in response to labor shortages, tried to freeze wages or raise taxes, pushing the poor even further into despair. This tension exploded into uprisings, like the Jacquerie in France, the Peasants' Revolt in England, and the Ciompi Rebellion in Florence. By the late Middle Ages, Europe was fractured, politically, socially, and spiritually. Ethnic conflicts increased, laws forbidding mixed marriages appeared, and many local disputes escalated into full-scale wars. Yet amidst all this turmoil, change was brewing. Feudal labor was slowly replaced by cash rents, giving peasants more autonomy. Slavery began to fade in much of Western Europe, though in Central and Eastern Europe, many formerly free peasants fell into serfdom. By the 15th century, literacy among men in England was around 10%, while among women it was only 1 or 2, a reminder that education was still a privilege of the few. Superstition remained common. Magic, curses, and the supernatural dominated popular belief. The Inquisition, in its later phase, intensified efforts to suppress heresy and witchcraft. Politically, power became more centralized. Monarchs worked closely with local elites, and royal administrations began to protect the lower classes. Law became more professionalized, with trained lawyers replacing the arbitrary judgment of kings. Across Europe, new kingdoms were forming. In Germany, the emperor's power weakened. In Italy, city-states like Florence, Milan, and Venice flourished independently. The rivalry between England and France ignited the Hundred Years' War in 1337, a brutal conflict that ended in 1453 with France driving the English out of its lands. England soon faced its own turmoil, the War of the Roses, until Henry VII rose to power. Meanwhile, in Iberia, Portugal launched campaigns against Muslim forces in Morocco, while the marriage of Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon united Spain. Their conquest of Granada in 1492 ended centuries of Muslim rule and completed the Reconquista. In Northern Europe, Margaret I of Denmark united Denmark, Norway, and Sweden under the Kalmar Union in 1397. Farther east, Ivan III of Moscow began consolidating power, annexing lands once part of Kievan Rus. But in the southeast, the Byzantine Empire crumbled under the might of the Ottoman Turks. After centuries of decline, Constantinople finally fell in 1453 to Sultan Mehmed II, marking the true end of the Middle Ages. Yet even as empires fell, prosperity returned. Cities like Florence, Venice, and Genoa thrived through trade and banking. Feudalism was giving way to a money-based economy, and merchants began to rival nobles in wealth and influence. Curiosity and ambition drove explorers to seek new maritime routes to Asia, leading to an age of discovery. At the same time, a revolution in thought began to take shape. Philosophers like William of Ockham challenged Aristotelian logic, while Marsilius of Padua argued for the people's right to govern themselves. Scholars such as Petrarch rediscovered classical Greek and Roman texts, inspiring a movement that would redefine Europe, humanism. Humanists celebrated reason, education, and the dignity of man. Universities grew, schools expanded, and the rediscovery of classical works sparked new interest in science, art, and philosophy. And then, in the mid-15th century, Johannes Gutenberg invented the printing press, a breakthrough that changed everything. Books could now be mass-produced, knowledge spread faster than ever, and literacy soared. New ideas about art, science, and human potential flowed across Europe. It was the beginning of a new era, the Renaissance. From the ashes of plague and war, Europe rose again, wiser, stronger, and ready to rediscover the light it had long lost during the so-called Dark Ages. The Dark Ages were indeed grim compared to our modern lives, but not as hopeless as pop culture often paints them. Yes, people of that time faced massive challenges, invasions, economic instability, and the collapse of central authority. But the era was also one of resilience, adaptation, and the laying of foundations for future growth. Monasteries became beacons of learning and literacy, preserving ancient texts and nurturing new scholars. The feudal system, though often criticized, provided a framework for social organization and mutual protection. Technological innovations in agriculture, like the heavy plow and the three-field system, began to reshape Europe's landscape, increasing productivity and sparking population growth. The spread of Christianity, too, united diverse peoples under a shared spiritual and cultural identity. These developments paved the way for the intellectual and artistic awakening of the Renaissance. So, when we look back, the so-called Dark Ages weren't entirely dark. They were an age of transformation, slow, yes, but deeply significant. And if we look closely at our world today, maybe we're living through our own kind of transition, too. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video.